Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the first day of our 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you are not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. In the Related Content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our library of hundreds of additional resources, and links to several resources that we've personally selected that you should definitely check out. This 3-day bootcamp is eligible to earn up to 6 CPE credits, 1 for each of the 6 sessions, so 2 credits per day. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded that will need to be completed in order to receive the credit. Before we get started, let's go through introductions of our speakers for this 3-day bootcamp. Today's day 1 of the bootcamp. We'll start off with Hillary Dewhurst, Vinminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, who will discuss the third-party risk management lifecycle. Vinminder launched this particular lifecycle earlier this year and is a much more straightforward approach. After that, Vinminder's President, Kelly Vick, will walk us through the contracting step of the onboarding stage. Tomorrow, for day 2 of the bootcamp, we will discuss the ongoing stage of the lifecycle. Lisa Mayhill, Vinminder's Director of Information Security Operations, will cover SOC reports and cybersecurity, and then Hershey Long, Vinminder's Senior Information Security Specialist, will discuss business continuity management. After Hershey, we will be joined by Raman Zachariah, Vinminder's Chief Financial Officer, who will walk us through vendor financial health. Then on Thursday, the last day of the boot camp, Greg Cameron, Vinminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Advisory, will discuss the offboarding stage of the life cycle, including termination and exit plan execution and third-party risk management closure. After Greg's sessions, Hillary Dewhurst will hop on again to wrap it all up with governance reporting and preparing for exams. So let's dive into the first hour with Hillary Dewhurst covering the life cycle and part of the first stage, onboarding. And in the second hour, we'll be on due diligence and contracting. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jessie, and welcome everyone to Bootcamp. So today, like Jessie mentioned, we are going to start off by diving into the third-party risk management lifecycle as a whole, just so we can all understand where and how all the pieces fit in as we move throughout these sessions. Then I'll get into the weeds of onboarding, including planning and risk assessments. Of course, we're going to give some examples, we'll go over the risk categories, and then we'll review how, technically speaking, how inherent risk might be reduced to get your residual risk rating, and more specifically, what it means to mitigate risk. We're going to wrap up with some best practices and some mistakes to avoid. So let's get started. So here it is, the third-party risk management lifecycle. Now, if you're familiar with the third-party risk management lifecycle, you're going to immediately notice that now it looks like a linear path, which is different than the circular representation or that spinning wheel we've seen in the past. The primary activities within the lifecycle have now been divided into 3 distinct stages, which are onboarding, ongoing, and offboarding. So why did we feel the need to make this change? Well, first of all, when we lay the life cycle out like this, it really helps reflect what we're doing with any third-party vendor at any given time and simplifies that vendor status so everyone can understand it. We also are really calling out the foundation of the life cycle, which is governance, which includes oversight and accountability, documentation and reporting, and independent reviews that all support the process. Now, as far as our vendors are concerned, there really are only 3 stages to any vendor engagement. That's onboarding, ongoing monitoring, and when that relationship ends, there's offboarding. And the identification, assessment, and management of the risk activities may be slightly different depending on which stage of the life cycle you're in. So the whole process is really meant to simplify and clearly help you identify where you're at and what needs to happen next. Now remember, we're going to cover the specific activities over the next 3 days. And just remember, as with all of the information we give you, this is guidance. The way it is applied can and should be adjusted to meet the needs of your organization. Our goal is to just help you understand the value of each step, as well as improving your third-party risk management strategies and processes. So we're really excited that you've joined this session, and we'll hope you join us over the next couple of days. And we really want you to get a lot of value out of it. So let's just jump into that life cycle in more detail. To start off, we're going to talk about onboarding, which is the first stage in the third-party life cycle. Now, before I get into that, I want to point out something that's very important. The third-party risk management life cycle is a series of activities that should be conducted in a specific order. And there is actually a reason for that. Because third-party risk management is really a collection of interdependent processes, doing those activities in the correct order really gives you foundational information off which to build to the next step and to guide your actions and decisions moving forward. So I do want to mention that it's very important to try and follow the order of the activities as much as possible to make sure that you are getting all the right information before moving to the next activity. I also want to say that onboarding is probably the most important stage of the life cycle. Now, all of the stages are incredibly important, but without proper onboarding, we're not going to have an effective relationship with that vendor for one reason or another. Now, think about it this way. Once you start with the notion that you need a product or service that's delivered by a third party, that is where onboarding begins. And onboarding covers all the activities from identifying that need right up to the initial execution of the contract for the selected third-party vendor. So during onboarding, we need to ensure that we're adequately prepared for that vendor relationship. And we need to understand all the risks associated with the product or service and therefore the vendor. We also need to understand if that product or service is going to be critical to our operations or to our customers. Once all those risks are identified and assessed, then we can conduct due diligence to confirm that the vendor has the appropriate controls to manage those identified risks. This information can help us calculate residual risk, and from there, we can formalize the relationship in the form of a contract. All right, so your T's are crossed, your I's are dotted, the contract has been executed. Now you are ongoing, and that means that your vendor is moving into the business as usual stage. And honestly, this is where most of our vendors are going to be at any given time. You know, during this stage, it's all about keeping your eye on the relationship. And we do this in several ways. We do it by periodically reassessing the risk of the engagement. We're updating our due diligence information and documents. And we're constantly just measuring the risk of that relationship. But between those formal risk assessments, we need to constantly monitor both risk and performance on a regular basis, because we need to make sure that the relationship is still delivering the anticipated value and that there are not any new or emerging risks that need to be managed. Now, this particular section, or ongoing, has been a little confusing for folks, and this is one of the reasons we pulled away from the wheel, because these activities that happen in monitoring, they do repeat, and they repeat at regular and predictable intervals until you move into offboarding. So if everything is good with your vendor, they've delivered the right product or service with good performance, they have an acceptable risk profile, should the time come to renew the contract, you're going to be positioned to do that. Or on the flip side, if they're not in good shape, then you could move into offboarding to terminate that contract. Now, the final stage in the third-party risk management lifecycle is offboarding. And you know what? A lot of organizations just kind of fall apart during this step. It's like, oh, we need to cancel the contract. But offboarding really should be a systematic and incremental set of activities that help you wind down that relationship in a safe and effective manner. So onboarding really starts from the moment you've decided that you're going to cancel the contract. And it includes that formal termination to the vendor, notifying them officially that the contract is not going to be renewed or it's going to prematurely end. During offboarding, we have to be really mindful of our exit plan, and we have to execute it perfectly. This plan should include all the duties and responsibilities of both parties and who does what when the contract is ended. It also includes making sure that we are either destroying data or getting it returned, that we're returning assets, that we're revoking any vendor access to our systems, our networks, or facilities, and that we are really making sure that everything is either positioned correctly to move to another vendor, to bring the information or the activity in-house, or to stop the activity altogether. Finally, to wrap everything up, we need to review and pay those final invoices and really update the vendor status in all our systems, not just the third-party risk management systems, but accounts payable and maybe your procurement systems as well. We make sure that we document all of the information and archive it appropriately so it's really easy to get to should there be an audit or exam. Now, while you think about those three stages, I think it's time for our very first poll. So I'll turn it over to Jessie.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the bootcamp. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, which area of vendor risk management do you consider to be your weakest? Onboarding, ongoing monitoring, offboarding, or all of the above? And Hillary, it looks like we have time right now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience.
Super.
And that question is, from a regulatory perspective, do we have to do all the activities in all three life stages?
That's a good question. It's also a tricky question. So different sets of regulatory guidance are written different ways. Some are very explicit and some are more suggestive and more like an overview. I will tell you that most of the regulatory guidance we see out there broadly, whether it's for financial institutions or healthcare or other industries, does have some pretty strict requirements about what is required throughout the life cycle. But here's something to remember. Following the life cycle and the specific activities, whether it's explicitly called out in your regulation or not, is still a best practice because you will not get penalized for being more comprehensive than the guidance is asking you to be. So, yes, some regulations call for everything. Some are more suggestive. Do it anyway, and you will be good. That's my answer.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find the Third-Party Risk Management Lifecycle Toolkit. This toolkit provides an ebook, infographic, template, and a printable PDF that is all-encompassing of the new lifecycle. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, well, that was interesting. I've really loved seeing the answers to the polls. It really helps me understand where our participants are in the process, and hopefully it helps you understand where you fit in on the spectrum of these things. But now that we have a good overview of the life cycle, it's time to really jump into those activities that must be completed in the onboarding stage. And so we're going to start off with planning and risk assessment. So the agenda for this next section is we're going to get into planning, and we're going to talk about identifying your exit strategy. I'm also going to spend a good amount of time on identifying the risks associated with the vendor, and we're going to wrap up this segment with some best practices. In case you missed it earlier, here's where planning risk assessment fits into the third-party risk management lifecycle. It's one of the very first things we do, and you can see it's in the onboarding stage. These are the first onboarding activities to complete. So let's take a look at how they're done. So I know I really stressed how important onboarding is and how important planning for that relationship is, because planning for the relationship is one of the first activities in the life cycle. So we start off with identifying the benefits and the need for that relationship. So why are we bringing this vendor on board? Do we have a problem to solve? Do we have an opportunity to realize? You know, what additional capabilities do we need to run our operations? Whatever the reason you're bringing that vendor on board, you should clearly be able to state the need and the benefits. That's the very first step, and it's a really important step too. To choose a vendor, you need to be able to identify what they specifically need to deliver to your business. And if you don't know and you can't articulate it, then the vendor's not really going to know either. So that first step, after we've determined what we're doing and why we're doing it, is to determine if the product or service is going to actually fall within the scope of third-party risk management. Now, your organization may exclude certain vendors or other third parties from your vendor risk management program for various reasons. Many organizations, for example, do not include any public utilities in their vendor risk management program. Donations and sponsorships are another one that's commonly left out. But once you identified if the activity is going to be in scope, you're going to next need to identify who is going to be responsible for that vendor. Now, what do we mean by responsible? Well, first of all, who is actually going to be on point to own that relationship from a third-party risk management perspective? That means who's going to complete all the vendor risk management activities and deliverables? Whose name is going to be on the report next to that vendor should something go wrong? This individual also should be expected to collaborate with risk experts or the third-party risk management team and other stakeholders regarding that vendor. The vendor owner should be someone who is knowledgeable about the product or service, since they're going to be essentially responsible for managing the risk of the relationship. So if they don't really understand the product or service, I'm not necessarily going to do the best job of identifying or managing those risks. The vendor owner is also responsible for identifying the exit strategy. And the exit strategy identifies what direction the organization will take if that vendor fails. So you're starting to get the picture, aren't you? Preparing and planning for a vendor relationship are essential, because when we don't understand what the activity is or who is going to manage it, and most importantly, what are we going to do if the vendor fails, we're just really spinning our wheels, and we're setting our organization and its customers up for potential disaster. So I want to pause for just a moment and talk about the exit strategy. There's a couple things we're going to cover here, but I also want to let you know that in day 3 of the boot camp, Greg Cameron will be covering exit strategies in more details. So if you need more information than you're getting today, make sure you come back on day 3. So before we find that contract and bring that vendor on board, we need to identify what the organization would do if the vendor fails or just doesn't work out. For example, would we transition that product or service to another vendor? Or would we bring that service in-house? In some cases, you may decide that, well, it's not really worth it, and we're going to just stop doing that activity altogether. We're just going to discontinue the product or service. Whatever your strategy is, you really need to put some thought into this step. So, for example, let's say your strategy is to transfer to another vendor. Is another vendor available? Did you do an RFP and maybe there was a runner-up? Have you checked back in with that vendor to make sure that they still have capacity and desire to service your business? What would the pricing be? Do you understand what it would take in times of resources, time, and money to make that transition? Or let's say that you're bringing the activity in-house. That sounds a lot simpler than it is, especially if you have to hire new people to perform the activity. Would you have budget to do that? Would that take a whole another budget request and a special approval? How long might that take? You need to establish the exit strategy very early on because you should be able to specify your organization's service requirements during the relationship and during the end of the vendor relationship. And we want to make sure that the vendor understands that and is obligated through the contract to perform to those specific levels of performance. Now, we need to also, during the exit strategy, think about all the other stuff, like consider how our data will be returned or destroyed, what we need to get back, whose access do we need to cut off. We also, in this process, need to think about something called deconversion costs. For example, what if we have to terminate that contract early? Is there a fee we have to pay the vendor? Or what if we need to hire and train a bunch of new employees to bring that function in-house? Again, do we have that money budgeted? Remember, cost is not always just about hard dollars, but it can also be reflected in reduced revenue or lower production levels until a new vendor is fully operational. So another step in the onboarding stage is to determine if a vendor is critical or not. Now, I'm going to say something really clearly here, and I might say it more than once today, but critical is not a risk rating. Critical is a classification and a way to identify those specific vendor engagements that pose the greatest threat to your operations or your customers if there's a vendor failure. So one of the first steps has to be to determine if it's critical or not critical. That label of critical really indicates that the size, severity, and duration of the impacts to your business resulting from a vendor failure would be more or less catastrophic. So the 3 questions we often see to determine criticality would be, would the sudden loss of this vendor cause significant disruption to your organization? Would that disruption impact your customers? And if the time to recover those operations exceeds 24 hours, will there be a negative impact that quickly? And those 3 questions work really well in most cases. But we're going to spend a minute here. Depending on your organization, you might also consider some other questions. So one would be, are there significant financial investments, resources, and time required to implement the third-party relationship and manage all the risks? So, for example, suppose your organization just used like 80% of your engineering team for 6 months. We spent millions and millions of dollars to implement a game-changing product. That would be really hard to do twice, and so that vendor relationship would likely be critical. Another consideration would be if there would be a material impact to your organization's operations if you have to engage an alternate third party or if outsourced activity has to be brought in-house. So even if you can't bring it in-house, do you have the employees, the budget, and the time to recruit and onboard? Do you have all the necessary programs, equipment, and space? This is something to think about. Another one, can that third-party failure negatively impact your reputation and brand? And that one definitely speaks for itself. But one more consideration, and this is really important for our regulated industries, is could that third-party vendor failure attract regulatory scrutiny or result in enforcement actions, including fines? So let's say you have a vendor providing call service center for collections. Now those agents would be dealing with a very sensitive subject, collections. And there are many, many rules and regulations they must follow to keep your organization out of trouble. They work directly with customers, and they have access to very sensitive personal data. So that one would likely be a critical vendor as well. So what types of services are generally considered as critical? Well, here's some examples. Data centers, core processing, call centers, payment systems and ledgers, cloud service providers, health and safety systems. Again, it all depends on your business. But if you run a business, for example, that's completely online and your shopping cart function is out and there would be no way to accept an order, that might be a critical vendor. So if you're a hospital that depends on backup generators and they fail after a natural disaster, critical vendor. So I think you all get the point. I just want to make sure we all understand conceptually what criticality really is. When we think about third-party risk management, really one of the core activities is identifying the risks that we need to manage. That's present really throughout the life cycle. But in the beginning, we need to do something called an inherent risk assessment. And this assessment is going to help us understand the types and amounts of risk that are associated with that product or service that we're looking to outsource. So we would think about questions like, is that vendor going to need access to sensitive or confidential data, for example? Or would the product and service help us meet any regulatory requirements? And of course, is the product or service critical to our organization? So when you're thinking about inherent risk, it's really important to realize that we're thinking about the risk that's just natural risk or raw risk. We're not thinking about any potential controls at this point that could help us mitigate that risk. That comes along later in the process. So let's look at some examples of third-party risk, what types of things we might be looking for. Okay, so we know we have the inherent risk assessment that we have to do, and that inherent risk assessment really is about helping the organization identify the different types and amounts of risk that are present in that product and service, and therefore the relationship. So here's a list of the most common risks we tend to assess. Keep in mind, your organization, depending on how you're organized and your internal processes and procedures. Okay, now that we've identified our actual risk categories, it's time to go about the business of identifying which of those specific risks exist in any one vendor engagement. So we want to talk about inherent risk assessments here because that is the process that's going to help us do that. Now, this is a really important process, and getting this right is essential because what we do with the information resulting from this process is really going to help us determine how we're going to manage and treat that vendor throughout its life cycle. So let's begin with the inherent risk assessment is an internal process. That means that we're not asking the vendor to participate at this particular time. And it's the vendor owner that should be completing the questionnaire as part of the inherent risk assessment process. Now, if you're wondering why the vendor owner should be filling out the questionnaire, it's because they're going to be responsible for that product or service, and therefore they are the best ones to know about what risk types are going to exist. So it's internal, and the vendor owner is completing the questionnaire. Now, when it comes to the questionnaire, I want you to look at this slide. There are the risk categories on the left and some questions on the right that we could ask to determine the presence of those risks in the engagement. Now, I'm not going to read these all to you, but I do want you to take a look at them, and I want you to notice something else. These questions are very simple, so simple, in fact, that most of them can be answered simply yes or no. And we want to keep this process really simple because the more complex it gets, the more convoluted it gets. And it's a pretty well-known fact that just adding more complexity doesn't always give you better or more risk information. So keep this process really simple. Your vendor owner is going to go through this questionnaire. They're going to answer the questions, and each particular question should have a scored response. So we want to make sure that you understand that your organization determines what that scoring methodology looks like. You know, some organizations may choose to weight one category over another. You know, there's different ways to do this, but however you do it, you want to make sure that at the end of this questionnaire process that you have a score or a risk level. Now, when it comes to those risk levels, in the spirit of keeping things really simple, we recommend that your risk scale is really only consisting of low, moderate, and high risk. And again, that is to help keep it simple, and we're not necessarily going to get better or more risk information by adding a lot of levels of risk. Now, if your vendor has access to your network or has access to highly sensitive data, or if they're interacting with your clients, no matter what, that vendor should be inherently high risk. So at the end of this questionnaire, we have our risk level or risk rating, and we also know if the vendor is critical to our organization or not. And those are the two really important pieces of information that we're going to need to take with us as we move through the process. At the end of your inherent risk assessment, you're going to end up with two pieces of data that you need for every vendor engagement, not just the vendor, but every engagement. So is it critical or non-critical to the operation, and what is the risk rating? Now, I've said it before that risk ratings and criticality are not the same thing, but I want to explore a common misperception that all high-risk vendors are critical or vice versa, but that really isn't the case. So let's explore some examples to make this point. Let's say in scenario one that you have a vendor, they come on site, they provide essential call center services that you are contractually and legally obligated to have available for your customers. Furthermore, you don't have any additional staff to fill in if need be. That would make those vendors critical because you could face severe repercussions if they're not there to do their job. But in another situation, maybe you have vendors come on site to supplement your sales department by trying to generate new leads and upsell existing customers. You might have some personnel dedicated to that job anyway, but maybe wanted more call volume to boost your numbers. If those vendors suddenly went out of business, it's not going to affect your operations. True, it may take a little bit more time to generate leads, but all in all, it's an add-on service. It's not actually essential. Those same vendors are high risk, but they're not critical at all. It might seem that high risk and critical are alarming words, but in truth, there's really nothing wrong with either one. None of our organizations can operate without them, right? So to manage third-party risk, we need to know, manage, and accept the risks associated with our vendors. Now with that, I think we're ready for another poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, how does your organization determine the vendor's inherent risk? A best guess based on services and no real quantification, points or tally system, or other homegrown methods such as Excel, methodology unique to a software application, or other. Hillary, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer.
Okay.
Who is supposed to complete the inherent risk assessment?
Well, The person who is the vendor owner or has that direct relationship with the vendor should be conducting or performing rather that inherent risk assessment. And I'll tell you why, because this individual should know as much about the product or service as is possible within the organization because they're going to be responsible for it. They should also know the reason and the benefits that they're choosing to use a third party. So the third party vendor owner or the risk owner for that third party really should be the one filling out that inherent risk assessment and making sure all the questions are correct because after all, they're best positioned to do that in the organization.
Thanks, Hillary. Please go ahead and submit your responses as we will be closing the poll momentarily. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our How to Do a Vendor Risk Assessment infographic in the related content widget. This infographic is a helpful resource as it walks through the steps to complete a risk assessment. I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
One of the last things I want to cover in this section is to go over some of the things we can do to lessen or decrease our inherent risk. And here are the 4 typical risk handling techniques. So you can avoid risk, you can formally accept it, you could transfer risk to insure against loss, but then there's mitigation, and that's all about verifying and implementing control. So let's get into these risk handling techniques a bit more. The first one is avoid. Don't do it. Your inherent risk assessment can help you understand if there are actually avoidable risks. So an example might be don't send more information than you need to. Don't use certain methods for transferring data. Having some good risk-based training in your organization is another way to help people understand how to avoid risk. The next one is formally accept the risk. So the point of risk management first is to understand the risk and then to decide if the risk is acceptable. There will be times when there are risks that cannot be mitigated, and that's just part of the business. The point is to ensure that your leaders are aware and can make informed decisions about what to do about it. Sometimes that decision will be to accept the risk. As a best practice, though, risk acceptance should always be a formal process that includes documentation about the risk, the rationale for accepting, and who, of course, accepted the risk. All right, so let's talk about transferring risk. Now, let's be clear. We can outsource activities. We can never outsource the risk. What we're transferring here is the financial liability, or we're insuring against loss. So the best example of this would be an insurance policy or contractual terms that still hold us accountable, but transfer that financial impact to another party, such as an insurer or the vendor. The organization can transfer liability, but ultimately you're accountable. And then there's risk mitigation and controls. And there are 2 primary types of controls: preventative controls that are intended to prevent bad things from happening, and they can include actions like you have to have authorization, or we have good segregation of duties, or the principle of least privilege, or maintaining good physical security. There's additional controls, which are detective controls that are intended to detect something bad has already happened. Now, before we move on, I want to pause and talk about controls just a bit more. So our call today has a wide range of participants. So I want to make sure that everyone is familiar with what we mean by controls. So controls are a combination of people, processes, and tools that are put in place to prevent, detect, or correct issues caused by unwanted events. When we talk about mitigating controls, They can be internal or external controls. Some examples of having internal controls might be that separation of duties. So the person approving the expense is not the same one writing the check, or conducting penetration tests on your network. Employee training is another preventative control. To illustrate this just a bit more, let's say that you're engaging a vendor to provide customer service at that call center. One of the risks in this activity is going to be customer dissatisfaction. But those risks could be minimized by ensuring that all customer service agents are trained in both issue remediation and appropriate messaging. When it comes to assessing vendor risk, we are also reviewing the vendor's control environment. And that usually means that we're looking at their controls that they already have in place. So how do we get from inherent risk to residual risk? Well, up until this point, you've conducted your risk assessment, you have a risk rating, you know if that vendor is critical. So now we need to look at that and determine if we're just going to accept the risk and move ahead. But chances are that most of us are not going to do that. There's usually something that can and should be done to lessen the level of risk we're really exposed to. You know, typically we do this by implementing or evaluating existing controls. Then, after those controls are applied, we can come to a determination of what residual risk really is. And this really all happens by assessing that initial risk, then attempting to mitigate that risk. Once that risk is mitigated, you can calculate the residual risk. So the concept is very simple, but we always get a lot of questions about it. So let me see if I can illustrate this for you. Let's look at the visual for a moment. So in this very simple graphic, we have inherent risks that need to be addressed with validated controls. And the risks that are presented in this example are considered high risk. So in this example, the vendor has a 24/7 operation. They have access to PII, and they're processing payments. They also need to be licensed in the states where they do business. So there's quite a lot of risks there. So we've identified the risk, and now we're going to mitigate the risk we find unacceptable, or we're going to treat them. Once we treat the risk, the leftover risk or the residual risk rating can be established. The point is that your organization needs to know and decide if that planned treatment is enough or not, because you won't be able to completely eliminate all the risk. It's just simply not possible. Therefore, some of the risks are going to remain at a certain level. And this really speaks to what a risk appetite is. So another way to think about this would be, maybe your organization is okay with big risk because maybe there's a big payoff. Or maybe your organization prefers minimal risk and more security. Okay, now we can examine some of the controls that might counterbalance some of those inherent risks. So first of all, this vendor is PCI certified. Yay! So they meet all the requirements to accept the payments. They're also fully licensed and have a satisfactory SOC report. So now our residual risk is somewhat lower than the inherent risk. But I want to be very clear on something else here. Residual risk is not a risk rating. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Residual risk is not a risk rating. It is a measure of effective control. So why is this even important? Well, the purpose of residual risk is to find out whether or not the planned treatment is going to be sufficient. And the question is, how do you know what is sufficient? Well, I can't tell you what's sufficient for your organization because your organization must identify the level of risk it's dealing with and determine whether more or different controls are necessary. And that's really where the concept of acceptable levels of risk come into play. It's nothing else but deciding how much risk appetite your organization has. So does your management think it's fine to operate in a higher risk environment, or would they prefer to operate in a lower risk environment that has a higher level of security? So you need to use your residual risk score very wisely. And remember, it's only a tool to help your organization decide if that vendor engagement is within the risk appetite or risk tolerance. do not use your residual risk rating to set any of your third-party risk management monitoring schedules or reassessments, because that is an audit or exam finding just waiting to happen. So while you think about that, I think we are ready for another poll. Jessie?
Our next poll question is, how does your organization conduct vendor due diligence? Based on risk ratings, based on inherent risk, combined or both, use different metrics, or you're not sure? And Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Okay.
That question is, should a fourth party be considered in the third party risk rating?
Well, that's a tricky question, and it's kind of multi-layered. So let me begin with the inherent risk rating, which is really what is determining your third party's risk rating. You will probably not be asking any questions about the fourth parties within that inherent risk rating. So no, they should not be included. However, as you're moving through due diligence and really confirming all the vendor's controls, if the vendor has a fourth party that they've declared, maybe they're considered critical, and they do not have good third-party risk management practices at the vendor, then that fourth party may factor into your residual risk rating. But in the beginning, in the inherent risk rating, you shouldn't be considering your third party's vendors. You should really be looking at those risks that are inherent first to the product or service, and then the relationship itself. I hope that makes sense for everyone.
Thanks, Hillary. And as a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. Thank you. And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it's always interesting to see what everyone says. As a reminder, in the related content widget, we have our Inherent Vendor Risk Sample Questions and Next Steps resource, which contains an ebook and a questionnaire to assist you. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
So we've covered quite a bit in an actual short amount of time. So let's wrap up the planning and risk assessment activities. We need to identify and articulate why we're outsourcing and what are the benefits we're expecting to get. We also need to identify who is going to own that vendor and make sure that it's somebody familiar enough with the product or service that they can sufficiently manage the risk associated with it. And yes, we have to think about ending that relationship before it's even really begun, which means figuring out what we're going to do if that vendor relationship comes to an end. We also have to determine if that vendor is going to be critical to our operations. And we have to complete that inherent risk assessment to get our risk rating or risk level. After due diligence and a thorough examination of the controls, you will have enough information to determine the residual risk. And again, residual risk is only to be used as a measure of confidence in your controls. We don't ever use residual risk as the baseline for our third-party risk management activities. So keep all of that in mind, because we are going to come back after the break and we will be discussing due diligence and preparing the vendor contract during our next segment. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary, for those informative sessions. Before we move on to our next session, where Hillary will discuss vendor due diligence, we are going to take a quick 5-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 5 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move into our next onboarding session, which is due diligence. We'll be hearing more from Hillary Dewhurst. Again, she's VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. Hillary, back to you.
Thank you, Jessie. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue through the onboarding stage, and we are going to continue with a review of the due diligence process. It's a really important step, so we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about it. Here is where initial due diligence fits into the third-party risk management lifecycle. We will be discussing a little bit about how to do due diligence, what you should be reviewing, who should be reviewing it, and what to do when your due diligence is complete. So when should you risk assess your vendors? Well, initially, we're going to perform that initial due diligence process to assess our vendors during the onboarding stage. Because at the conclusion of that initial due diligence, then we have the information to decide if we want to continue assigning the contract or not. But once that contract is signed and you're actively in that relationship, you're also going to need to continue to monitor their risk, and that means doing periodic risk reassessments and updating and refreshing due diligence. So that's one of the reasons they refer to that stage as the ongoing stage, because these activities are ongoing, and they continue throughout the life of the contracting relationship until you move into offboarding. So we're doing a full session on the ongoing stage tomorrow, but for now, let's just talk about due diligence. Now, let's look at the components of vendor due diligence. We already know probably quite a bit about the vendor since we've done the inherent risk assessment. But now we really need to vet that vendor. And due diligence is the way you determine if a vendor is a good company with which to do business. But we do this in a stepwise approach. So first, we need to confirm the vendor is legitimate business with a solid reputation. And we need to really do this for every vendor, regardless of risk level. This is often overlooked. So make sure that you're gathering some basic information on your vendors, such as their state filing status or their incorporation papers, that they have a legitimate business license. We want to put them through an OFAC search. We want to make sure they have basic insurance, and we want to validate their tax ID. We also want to take a moment to look at their reputation by looking at the Better Business Bureau or doing an internet search for any negative news, consumer complaints, etc. Now, this is the very most basic information about your vendor or potential vendor that really needs to be part of your vendor selection process, because it's really not a great use of your time to go through the whole due diligence process and look at their controls and then find out that the business or the vendor doesn't exist as they say they do. But once we've confirmed that that vendor is legitimate with a solid reputation, we move towards the due diligence process. Remember, your risk rating and criticality are going to determine the level of due diligence that is necessary. The higher the risk, the more controls are necessary to mitigate those risks. So the more robust and extensive our due diligence must be. So let's just take a moment to understand why vendor vetting and initial due diligence are really so important. So besides confirming that a vendor is legitimate and has a good reputation and control environment, due diligence is really important for other reasons. So first of all, it allows you to make an educated decision about the vendor, not just a good decision, but one that's based on facts and is documented. And that decision should be one you could defend in an audit or regulatory exam. The second thing is it sets the stage for the relationship. So what do we mean by that? Well, from the very beginning, you are setting expectations for that vendor, not only from the perspective that you practice a trust but verify, but that you're holding them accountable to really high standards, not just when that relationship starts, but throughout the relationship. And yes, it is a good business strategy. I like to call this business strategy, inspect what you expect. But being a good business strategy really isn't enough because, as most of us are aware, it is required by regulators for many industries. But furthermore, due diligence is really the best way to systematically identify any gaps or weaknesses in your vendor's control environment. So I want to really talk about the three fundamental concepts of vendor due diligence for just a moment, because this will help us keep on track as we move through that process. So due diligence is the process of making sure that the vendor has the appropriate controls to manage those inherent risks. Now, remember, when we take our inherent risk assessment, that inherent risk assessment is really more or less vendor agnostic, because we're talking about the risks that exist in the product or service, and no matter which vendor we pick, they're still going to have the same controls to manage those risks. And due diligence is that process to look at the specific vendor's ability to manage those risks, okay? The second thing is that due diligence is always based on the risk and complexity of the product or service. So the highest risk product or service, they need the most robust and rigorous due diligence. And then finally, due diligence is always a pre-contract activity. Now, I want to really focus on this for a moment, because if an issue that you discover in due diligence is not really a deal breaker, you can add language to the contract to require remediation. But if you've already signed that contract before your due diligence is finished, how do you contractually obligate your vendor to fix anything that you find? And even worse, what if you find something really bad? You've already signed the contract and you're in business with them, and you've lost your ability to negotiate the terms of the contract. So now you don't have a lot of choices. You can move forward with all that risk, or you have to terminate them according to the signed contract terms. And all of that is just far more stressful and more work than just declining them in the first place. So make sure that your due diligence is absolutely completed before you execute any contract or contract renewal. Now, I read off some information just a few minutes ago about things you'd want to collect for every vendor, your basic vendor vetting, but here's an itemized list. Let's begin by looking at the information that we can gather for all vendors. Now, keep in mind, it's not going to be necessary to gather every piece of information for every vendor, but in general, first of all, we want to have a mutual non-disclosure agreement that protects both us and the vendor for any information that we're going to be sharing. We need basic information about that company. That's their name, address, headquarters, the ownership structure, and if there's any affiliated companies. We want their tax ID, business license. You know, we might be doing a credit report for them. We also want to know if there's any doing business as or previously known as business names, so your DBA or AKA or PKA. Dun and Bradstreet reports, if there's vendor complaints. We want to make sure that they give us a list of their subcontractors or fourth parties that will be critical in delivering the product or service to us. We want to look at that facility, make sure it's a real place, not just a street corner with a parking lot. And we want to look at the CFPB complaint database if, in fact, they are doing any interaction with our customer. Now, let's consider the data we should gather for this more elevated risk engagement. In most cases, you're going to use a combination of a questionnaire that's sent to the vendor, so the vendor risk questionnaire, due diligence questionnaire, and this will help you determine what categories you need to evaluate and get more information on. So once you've identified those risks, you can request and collect information and documents. And a great place to start is to request and review all internal policies and procedures, because they're going to give you the most insight into the vendor's in-house requirements and just how they accomplish them. Of course, the vendor's financial health is a really important consideration because we don't want them to go belly up during our contract. So we need to see audited financial statements where possible, and if not, the most recent financial statements. Independent third-party audits that objectively evaluate the effectiveness of a vendor's internal controls and compliance with regulatory and industry standards are also really important. And these should be a standard part of your due diligence request. This would include any SOC documents or PCI certifications, etc. And I cannot stress this enough. We need to look at business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. You know, after the last couple of years that we've all been through, all of your vendors should have updated plans that have been tested or are going to be retested in the near term. Because the intensity and duration of the COVID pandemic, we have supply chain interruptions, inflation, social unrest, you know, all of these things have essentially been a real world test for most companies. And the best organizations have already incorporated all that learning back into their business continuity plans. And we want to consider their legal situation. So have they been or are they currently defendants in material litigation? Are there judgments that found them at fault? If either is confirmed, you will need to investigate this information to evaluate their reputation and look for the red flags concerning their financial situation and ability to meet compliance requirements. Keep in mind that if they have numerous lawsuits, you should consider why. Some services, such as collections, for example, just have a lot of complaints, justified or not. So you need to keep in mind what the product or service is and explore what would be a high number of lawsuits in that situation. You also want to know if they've ever been subject to an enforcement action or have any regulatory findings. If so, they should be ready to provide you with the specific information in writing as the auditor or examiner presents it. So we gather up all these documents, but when we talk about due diligence and reviewing the documentation provided, it's really important to note that a lot of this information is really technical, and it takes a specific amount of skill to review these documents properly. And this is where subject matter experts come into the picture. Subject matter experts are those with the experience and qualifications to effectively evaluate vendor risk questionnaire and review those vendor-provided documents to determine if the right controls exist and if they're sufficient. SMEs should have professional certifications and credentials. It's not a good idea to just leave this task to someone who has a pretty good idea or knows a little bit about, because this is technical information. It should be reviewed by a qualified person. SMEs are really the individuals that can provide that qualified opinion when it comes to vendor controls. And they should also be providing documented assessments for those vendors during the due diligence process. So one thing we get asked a lot is, what actually are we confirming during these due diligence vendor risk reviews? And it really depends on the category, and it depends on the product or service and how much risk is there. But in general, let's look at some of the things we're trying to confirm. So when it comes to information security and privacy risk or cybersecurity risk, we're trying to confirm that the vendors who have any access to our data, those who transfer or store it or process it, they have all the necessary policies and procedures and technology to really protect that data, whether it's in motion or at rest. We're also trying to make sure that the integrity of the vendor's control environment is as they say it is, and we do that by looking at SOC reports and PCI certifications, etc. Now, the other thing about information security and privacy risk is that privacy risk can also be something that falls under compliance risk, but when we're looking at privacy risk, we're trying to make sure that vendor is only using the data that they have access to in a permissible manner, right? So they're doing what the data, what they say they're going to do, and what they're allowed to do. So let's look at some other risks. For legal and compliance risk, we are trying to confirm that the vendor understands and meets all regulatory requirements. One of the ways we can do that is to make sure that they're training their employees from a compliance perspective and that they have appropriate policies. We also want to make sure that they're not involved in a lot of litigation, and that really includes any past, present, or pending litigation. So when it comes to compliance, do they know and understand the rules? Do they apply the rules? Can they prove that they're training their employees? You know, what is their legal situation like? Another item to keep in mind with compliance is licensing. We want to make sure that if the vendor is required to have a license to operate in the state or to participate in the particular activity, that have one and it is current. So that is what we are looking for with legal and compliance risk. As I mentioned earlier, BCP plans are more important than ever. You really need to understand their plan of attack if there's an external event where systems, facilities, staff, or materials are not available. Now, I say materials because anyone who's been paying attention for the last few years will be aware of all the supply chain interruption issues. So if you're in manufacturing, for example, and you don't have the materials to manufacture your product, that is going to disrupt your business. Finally, there are the vendor's finances. Now, I think it's safe to say that without a favorable outlook, your vendor may not be in business very long, and the domino effect of that happening can have really significant impacts on your business. So we want to make sure that vendor is financially healthy. All right, what happens when you can't get something? You can't get these documents. And this is going to happen to all of us. There's nothing more frustrating than hearing from a vendor that they can't or provide you information to review, or we just don't hear from them at all. Now, one thing to consider is the vendor size. If they're a really big company, they're rarely going to have the resources to respond to every due diligence questionnaire or document request. You see this a lot with large public companies like Google, AT&T, big banks, all of them. Usually, this isn't as bad as it seems because many of these organizations will post their policies online. You may have to do some internet research to get what you need, but usually you can find enough to validate their controls. On the other hand, there's always those vendors that don't have the information you need or they don't want to share what they do have. In the first case, let's say you have a startup vendor and they can't give you a SOC 2 Type 2 report because they're only in their second year of business. Okay, fair enough, but the burden of proof is still on them. If they want the business, they need to come up with some alternative documentation or other methods that can evidence that they have those necessary controls. In many of these cases, you can go on site and that might satisfy some of your requests. In others, it's recommended that your subject matter expert is able to interview and speak with senior leaders and talk about specific controls. All of that must be documented, by the way. Now, if there is an outright refusal to provide proof of controls, you have to wonder why. And in some cases, the reason is that proof does not exist, and that should raise a huge red flag. Make sure you document all your discussions and attempts to get information from your vendor. And if there's a legitimate business reason that a vendor cannot provide you what you've requested, document that too, as well as any alternative methods used and if the controls were ultimately deemed sufficient by an SME. In some cases, your business may just choose to accept the risk, but any risk acceptances or waivers should come from senior management and the board if it's a critical vendor. They need to be formalized risk acceptance, documented, and retain that information. Finally, if an exception needs to be made, let's say our startup vendor, add terms to the contract so you can have the vendor provide you that information as soon as it's available. Make sure you specify a time. Now, of course, we've been talking about due diligence and due diligence documentation, and I know there's a lot to unpack there, and we can't get through it all in a single session, but I wanted to let you know that during tomorrow's bootcamp session, we're going to be covering some due diligence document types in depth. So, for example, tomorrow they're going to cover SOC reports, which are the systems and organizational controls reports. And you've probably heard of these. These are audit reports that are prepared by an independent third-party firm that sends auditors in to review both the existence and the effectiveness of a vendor's control environment. So different types of SOC reports look at different types of controls, say for financial controls or information security controls. Now, tomorrow they're also going to cover business continuity plans, and that's the document that details the vendor's specific plans to ensure that significant operations or products, services, whatever, can be delivered or delivered to an acceptable degree when there's an unplanned business interrupting event. And that could be a natural disaster or civil unrest or even, as we know, a pandemic. Then as part of the business continuity plan, there's also something called the disaster recovery plan, and that really details how the vendor is going to get up and running again after an event. We're also going to be covering cybersecurity plans, and those plans detail how the vendor protects itself from cybersecurity issues. And of course, this is really important when we have that vendor that's going to access our organization or customer data. Now, reviewing this report is really going to help your organization identify and understand any potential gaps or weaknesses that you will need your vendor to remediate. We're also going to be going through financial documents, and these documents can really help you determine if your vendor is financially healthy enough to maintain operations for the contract duration. And that could include balance sheets, profit and loss statements, and other financial information. So because these are all really important and essential components of due diligence, we'll make sure to come back tomorrow to get that in-depth review of how to read and interpret those documents. So we'll hope you'll come back for that one. All right, so as we're closing out our due diligence segment today, I want to just reinforce some really key concepts as part of the due diligence process. So the very first one is that at very minimum, we need to vet all of our vendors to make sure that they're a legitimate business, that they're not on a sanctions list, and that they have a good reputation. The next thing is that we need to make sure that the due diligence we're performing is in scope. That scope is proportionate to the risk in the engagement. So the more risk we have, the more robust and extensive that due diligence needs to be. It also is important to realize and keep this in mind that when you're doing more extensive due diligence, you are going to have a longer turn time on getting those SME reviews and reports. So you just want to prepare your vendor owner, hey, higher risk, this is going to take a little bit longer. The next thing is about SMEs. They should be reviewing the due diligence documentation. Now remember, these are the folks that have professional certifications or credentials that make them, the right person to give a qualified professional opinion on the sufficiency of those controls. And last but not least, if you cannot get something from the vendor, you need to make sure that you challenge them to give you an alternative method of validating the controls. Now, again, that can be an on-site visit, that could be an interview with their CISO or another high official at the organization that can speak to the controls to really verbally validate that those controls exist. We also want to make sure that if the vendor is not giving us something and they're not giving a good business reason why, that's a big red flag. So pay attention to that. In the case where they're not giving us something because they just don't have the information yet, make sure that you put language in your contract to get that information as soon as it's available. Now, if none of those things work and the information is just not available and they're not going to give it to you, you need to have a process to formally make exceptions and get approvals from senior leadership. So I hope you've enjoyed our session today, and I will pass it back to Jessie for our next segment.
Thanks so much, Hillary. We'll now wrap up the onboarding stage with our final topic for today's bootcamp session. VinMinders President Kelly Vick will now talk through the contracting step. Kelly, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jessie. Let's take a look at our agenda for the rest of the day. We'll talk about the overview of vendor contract management, and then we'll go into some elements of a vendor contract. We'll take a deeper look at service level agreements, and then we'll finish with some best practices. So let's go ahead and dive in. As you recall from Hillary's presentation earlier, contracting is part of the onboarding stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle, as you see on the slide you're looking at. Actually, as you can see, it's the last part because by now you have planned on what you need. You have performed a risk assessment on the solutions being provided by the third party, and hopefully you're doing this on multiple to have a comparison, and you've done the appropriate due diligence on both of them. And now it's time to go into the contracting phase. You may choose to go into the contracting phase simultaneously with multiple vendors that you have shortlisted, or you may make a choice and just go into the contracting phase with one. Whichever it is, you are now in the contracting step, which includes internal planning, negotiating, drafting, executing, storing, and managing, which we will dive into deeper. As I just noted on the previous slide, you've made a decision on a vendor. So now it's time to actually begin contract management phase. So what is vendor contract management? Well, it is the oversight of written agreements with these vendors or suppliers that you've chosen. It includes negotiating the terms of that contract, including all of those provisions and controls that are important to your organization. It includes a process to ensure that that contract is reviewed, approved, and executed properly, and that needs to be identified in your third-party risk management governance documents. Contract management also includes ensuring that all of your vendor contracts, regardless of the value, are stored in a central location and have proper controls in place. And I'll tell you, this is so important. We see customers every day who, when onboarding onto our platform, just do not know where to find all their contracts. So that is a very common challenge that we see. And lastly, contract management also includes the ongoing maintenance of the contract and the vendor relationship, and it's just very important over the term of the contract that you monitor compliance with these terms and ensure these critical dates and other critical requirements, such as the SLA, are managed. The bottom line here is that contract management is not a one-and-done process. It can be really one of the most difficult and time-consuming portions of all of third-party risk management. So make sure you have a good, solid process and a centralized process to contract management in place to avoid that challenge. So now that you know what vendor contract management is, why is it important? Well, that contract is a legally binding document, of course, that dictates the relationship you have with that vendor. Hopefully that's going to be a long-term relationship, so going into that contract with good mutual negotiation helps set the tone for the relationship. Hopefully that contract also helps with some spend visibility, some transparency in the organization of what spend you do have with that particular vendor. Maybe it will help identify some cost savings along the way. It also establishes what the expectations of all parties and helps enforce compliance among all parties. So inserting all of that appropriate contractual commitment and setting that expectation up front in the appropriate contract negotiations should help you avoid fighting down the road for information that you established up front. And one of the primary reasons contract management is so important is a solid process should help you from missing significant contract dates. For those of you in the financial institution space, the FDIC, the OCC, and the FFIEC in particular have some very prescriptive steps for contract management, and if you're interested in that, you can ask us for the specific details, and we'll be glad to share that with you. So let's take a look at who is generally involved in the contract management step. As you can see on this slide, I have kind of divided it into primary constituents and those who you would collaborate with. I've also added another list of folks that you would likely get involved with drafting SLAs if SLAs are included. The point I'm trying to make here is there's generally some people that will always be involved in your contracts. Legal, finance from a expense standpoint, the business owner, of course, who has championed that service, vendor risk management, and then there's others in other departments who you would likely should collaborate with, especially when it comes to needing the subject matter expert knowledge of things like information security, information technology, compliance and risk, and maybe the operations of the company. When you are working on drafting SLAs, you want people that are involved, boots on the ground, so to speak. So you want the people that are going to be working with the service, working with the vendor, understanding what that solution is doing so that you make sure you draft some reasonable and expected SLAs with that vendor. So just take a look at this list and recognize that there's should be multiple people involved, and it is, something that the better you get these people, the more you get these people involved, the better end results you will have in the contract document.
Here's the next poll question. This poll question is, in your organization, where does contract management sit? Executive management or the board, procurement, risk management, legal or general counsel, inside a line of business or department such as IT, marketing, or operations, or you don't know? Kelly, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, let's answer another question from the audience. And that question is, what are the chances that one of our vendors would agree to renegotiate a contract that is midterm?
Well, I think the answer to that is that it's going to happen more and more frequently these days as new regulations, especially around privacy, come out. I think you'll find contracts that you may have had in place for a number of years just not address some things that need to be addressed, whether you identify it and you go to the vendor and want to ask for that, or the vendor identifies it and they come to you and ask. As far as whether a contract could or should be renegotiated midterm, that really depends on the relationship. I've seen it go both ways. We've actually been asked by our customers, where we are the vendor, on a few occasions to do some contract negotiations midterms, and because we feel like we are a good partner with our customers, we oblige. Sometimes there may need to be skin in the game. Maybe it would take, a term extension or some other pricing concessions or something like that to entice the other party to make that change. I think the most important thing, though, to note with this is that the greater the relationship and the more it behaves like a partnership, the more likely both parties are willing to work to ensure that the right contract is in place for the relationship.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, I would like to share that in the related content widget, you'll find our vendor due diligence checklist available for download. This checklist is a perfect starting point for what you should be collecting on your vendors. Back to you, Kelly.
Contract negotiation can certainly be challenging and intimidating, but it's very important to know that negotiation is critical. You should not just accept the first contract that is given to you. Hopefully you have a contract template that you either can lead with or that you would at least refer to as you're reviewing your vendor's contract, but you want to be sure that both parties are involved in the negotiation. It's common to see changes and special requests from both parties, and that's what makes a good contract, is knowing that there is give and take on both sides so that you do come to a compromise that works for both parties. Bottom line is definitely don't just accept the first contract, and if you do have to accept the contract, be certain that you have read the contract to know what you are accepting. Up to this point, we've talked about the what, the why, and the who. So let's now take a look at, and over the next few slides, we'll dive even deeper, but look at some of the details within the contract language. So each of the elements that you see on this slide are kind of basic. It should be in every contract, regardless of the vendor relationship. So you want to make sure you cover a scope of the service and the expectations, the cost, performance standards, an SLA we're going to talk about in a few moments may not be in every contract, so that may be an iffy there. Termination provisions, certainly including notification period, automatic renewals, information security and confidentiality provisions, indemnification, liability, default and remedy, warranties, and ownership and license. I mentioned just a few moments ago about the FFIEC, the OCC, and the FDIC. If you are interested in those specific resources, please let us know and we'll get you that information. But these are good resources to go to even if you're not in the financial institution space, because they really lay out very specifically what is expected in a vendor contract. And we're going to talk through some more in just a moment, but that's a good place to start. The important thing is in this process is to involve people in your organization who understand these provisions and understand what changes to them, what the impact will be on your organization. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about some additional provisions that you should consider in your contract for your critical and high-risk vendors. And a few of them are listed here, such as insurance requirements, right to audit and receipt of their ongoing due diligence documentation. I think I've mentioned that a few times now. You certainly want to make sure that you're requiring copies of the business resumption and contingency plans, or business continuity and disaster recovery plans. It's very important to have covered, especially with these critical vendors, notification requirements. Same with high risk, things like subcontractor changes or key personnel changes, or maybe service location changes, but requiring notification to you on certain events that happen within them is a critical part of the contract with these vendors. And right now, also keep in mind with all the data privacy, and we'll talk about data privacy a few other times as well, but data retention and disposition upon contract termination is a very important element to include in your contract these days. When reviewing contracts with your critical and high-risk vendors, considering cybersecurity and information security is extremely important to be included in the contract. Just a couple of things to point out. You certainly would want access to their cyber and information security policies and procedures to be sure that they are managing their own responsibilities as it relates to the responsibilities of GDPR, HIPAA, GLIBA, CCPA, and any other relevant privacy law that's out there. You may have a data protection or processing agreement to cover all of that information. You may require that with this particular contract that you're working on. You want to address independent testing requirements and how often you would get those. The same with the results of any test results and how often you would get those results. Cyber resilience, we're going to talk about in just a few moments. Disclosure of their critical fourth parties, and especially those that have your data's access, is extremely important to include in the contract so that you know any changes with those fourth parties, whether you have the authority to approve them or the requirement to approve them before they make changes. So you definitely want to dive into that one, and then breach notification as well. All of these are important elements to be included with your critical and high-risk vendors. There should be provisions to address business continuity and disaster recovery as well. Not only should you have language requiring that you get receipt of the business continuity plan and disaster recovery plans on an annual basis, but they should also include the RTO, or the recovery time objective, and the RPO, recovery point objective, so that you can be certain that the return to normal state is as you would expect. Additionally, annual testing results should be provided. What you'll often find is that testing results are summarized depending on the relationship that you have with that vendor, the criticality of that vendor. It may be that you will require something more inclusive than that, and you may even require to be a part of the DR test, the annual DR test. If that's the case, these kinds of details need to be identified in the contract. You also want to know that backup responsibilities and management of their third party, their third parties are also taken care of, and that you have that documented in the contract as well. So your reliance on them means their reliance on their third parties, which are your fourth party, so we can't forget that part as well. All in all, to say that with your critical and high-risk vendors, this is, again, another very important element of the contract that needs to have some careful consideration. Working with vendors is challenging in this fast-paced, ever-evolving business environment that we are in. To reduce or minimize surprises and issues that may come about by a vendor's poor financial health, it's a very good practice, a best practice, to include requirements in the contract that you receive their financial information as part of the annual due diligence. Additionally, you could go as far as including certain SLAs related to financial performance or financial information that is required. Reducing friction in your business processes with vendors is key, but maintaining appropriate levels of risk with respect to the vendor's financial health is also important. So don't neglect it. Make sure that this is covered in the contract. As with anything, mistakes can happen, and they can certainly happen here, but here's a few that we recommend you avoid, and these are some that we've seen. But your regulators and your auditors are going to be looking for, well-developed and organized programs. So they're going to take exception with any of these contracts that are executed without appropriate due diligence, documented due diligence or vendor vetting and risk assessment before you even sign an agreement with that vendor. If senior management or whatever the appropriate approval is not obtained before signing that contract, if you don't have a defined contract management process in place that covers, all the steps in that contract writing process, and if you fail to track the proper dates of the contract, the important metadata of the contract, and fail to have them stored in an easy location so that you can gather the contract easily. Hopefully it's in a central repository. These are some common mistakes that we see happen, and certainly some of the ones that the examiners and auditors are going to be looking for.
This poll question is, do your contracts with vendors identify what will happen to your data upon termination? Yes, no, or not sure. And Kelly, here's another question for you from the audience. We do not have in-house legal, so all of our contracts are not reviewed by a legal expert. We do engage outside counsel, though, when necessary. What contracts should be reviewed by an outside counsel, and what are the best practices around legal review of contracts?
Well, I would first start with a best practice is that you have legal counsel, outside legal counsel or internal, if you have that, review a template or build a contract template that is your North Star, that is your guiding template that hopefully you can lead with the bulk of your customers, or the bulk of your vendors, rather. If you have some experienced personnel on staff, either maybe a paralegal or other senior team members who have had a great deal of contract experience, managing contracts, negotiating contracts, etc., then you can likely be successful leaning on them to review this, any changes to this template. But start with a template that has been approved, written by, worked on by outside counsel or some legal counsel. And then if you have those experienced people on your team, they should know what trouble areas they should avoid, or know when they need to lean in on outside counsel, even to review changes to that template. But if you don't have those folks and you don't want to have legal counsel, outside legal counsel review every contract, you would certainly want to lean on them to review any external contracts that come your way when your vendors won't accept your template, but they're giving you their language. You would certainly want to lean on them for that. You would probably want to lean on them when it's a critical vendor or a high-risk vendor that has a great deal of your data, and maybe you even have a dollar threshold of a certain amount that you're paying a vendor. You would want to lean on them for those as well. When you're not able to lead with your template, again, be sure that you are relying on your outside counsel's assistance when you are faced with unknown language on a contract. I think that is another best practice to hold on to.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before we move on, I would like to remind you that our vendor contract considerations, sample language, and recommended tips ebook is available in the related content widget. As we are discussing contract management, this is a great resource to take advantage of. Kelly, back to you.
So let's shift gears now and spend the last part of this segment talking about service level agreements. So what is an SLA? It's very simply an agreement that spells out the performance expectations and how that performance will be measured. Pretty plain and simple. A service level agreement should be a key component of every contract with your third-party vendors, or at least your critical ones. In addition to defining what's expected, the SLA should also detail how that service is to be measured, and it probably addresses remedies or penalties if the SLAs aren't met. So there are really countless examples of SLAs, and it truly depends on the service that that vendor is providing for you, but I just provided a couple of samples here just to make it clear what an SLA is. So one is service availability. So if the customer is providing you with an online solution, you want to make sure that that solution is available to you or your customers for a certain percentage of time. So it may be something like 99.5% availability. There's a lot more that would go around that, but that's just an example. Maybe some business metrics is something that you want to have as an SLA. For example, if this is a call center solution, you want some specific call center KPIs that you would include in your SLA, such as average talk time, average answer rate, average hold time, et cetera, things like that. Then there could be some technical metrics, and the main purpose of these technical metrics are to fix defects or bugs that are found in the system. So you may commonly find some SLAs around when priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 tickets will be addressed. So those are just a couple of examples of some SLAs. And why are SLAs important? Well, for one, it clearly sets the expectations of both parties, and going into a contract with a third party, it helps set the stage correctly going in. The SLA should give you some peace of mind that your vendor product or service will perform as you expected. If you set that up and you've both agreed to it, then hopefully going into it, that's what you should expect. It's also important because your service that you're getting from that vendor that you're making available to your customers, most likely, is an extension of you. So you want to make sure that the vendor understands that and you understand that these SLAs are significant and are centered around your customers' satisfaction with you, and that's why they're significant and important to you as well. It's very important also in defining these SLAs is to not go overboard and not try to measure too much. You can make too many things a priority and nothing is a priority. So make sure when you're writing that SLA that they are as simple as they can be, but that they are truly tracking and measuring the things that are the most important to measure. So on this slide, what you will see are elements that should be included in an effective SLA. For example, expectations and goals, I mentioned those a few moments ago. Metrics, what exactly are you going to be measuring? Well, the responsibilities of all parties. Who does what? Who's responsible for what? Timing and frequency, as far as how often will those SLAs be measured. What are the services that are covered by the SLAs? Because you could have a contract that has multiple services included in that contract, and so all of those services may have the same SLA, may not. So you want to make sure that that's clear in that SLA agreement. It should also include some definitions. For example, if this is covering availability, define availability. Another very important thing to cover in the SLA is the monitoring process, like who's monitoring it, who's going to report on it, who is going to provide the specific information about whether the SLA was met or not met, and then what happens when it's not met and how is that resolved. And another key part of this is what happens if these SLAs are not met. Are there some termination provisions around these SLAs that give you the right out of the contract should they not be held up as expected? The bottom line with vendor SLAs is that there is not one size fits all. It truly depends on the service that's being provided, what information is available to be measured and to have written into an SLA. It's important during that due diligence process that you understand understand enough about that vendor during that time to understand what the risks are, what some service levels are that you should be looking for. So at that time, you're going to gather all that information so that you can write effective SLAs at the beginning of the contract. But it truly does depend on you, the vendor, and the product or service that they are providing as to what that SLA language will be and what it will include.
We are to the last poll question of the day. This poll question is, do you ensure your SLAs are integrated within your critical vendor contracts? Yes, no, or not sure. Kelly, I have another question for you from the audience that we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, what is a transition clause and when is it used?
A transition clause is hopefully part of the initial contract that you sign. So hopefully you negotiate this into the contract language. But what the purpose of a transition clause is it speaks to the obligations of both parties when the contract ends, speaks to contract termination and what happens. So it's part of what you would refer to as your vendor offboarding process. What it should detail is things like what happens to your data once your contract terminates. Does it automatically get destroyed? Does it automatically get returned to you? What specifically happens to it? It should also cover things like what's your time period to get your data back, to retrieve your data from the system before it just gets terminated, because chances are you're leaving this system to go to another system or another solution, so you want to be able to make sure your data is not held hostage and that you're able to get it back to transition it over, thus the name of the clause. It also should really clearly state what happens when you terminate. Is it automatically shut down, or is there a period of time that is the transition period for you to make that transition to the new system? It should cover, again, whether these things happen automatically or whether a formal request is required to make it happen. And it should also cover things like how will you get this information? Do you have to download it? Do you have to get it in individual files? Can you systematically have it transmitted? All of those nuts and bolts of that offboarding process is what is typically covered in that clause. Now, I said in the beginning it should be negotiated into the contract at the time of execution. However, it's possible if this is a very large vendor covering a very extensive amount of services for you, it's possible that you have a completely separate agreement that is going to cover this in very, very fine detail, more so in a separate agreement than in the original contract. So there are times that you would see it as a separate agreement.
And here are those results. Thank you everyone for answering this question, as it's always interesting to see what everyone says. As we just discussed vendor SLAs, I would like to mention that we have our 8 vendor service level agreement best practices infographic available for download in the related content widget. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Kelly.
So we've spent the time up to this point talking about what should be included in an SLA and how to get them documented within the contract. But when are you going to actually review those SLAs? Well, again, I mentioned this several times now, but you're going to first think about those SLAs during that due diligence process when you're first looking at that vendor, because that's when you're going to write the SLAs when you get into the contract. This is when you're going to gather those, again, specific details about that product and service, and spend time collaborating with your team to make sure you uncover all of the expectations of that vendor. But the formal review of the SLA should happen at that contract stage, so that when you have the contract in hand, you're writing the SLA appropriately to cover everything at that time. And then you certainly want to monitor those SLAs on an ongoing basis throughout that vendor relationship. And that is going to depend on how you wrote the SLA, whether it is on a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, an annual basis, whatever it is. But again, this too, just like the contract, is not a one and done process. That SLA oversight or review should be done probably more routinely than the contract management needs to be reviewed, but certainly should be done, set up in some kind of review state with that vendor on an ongoing basis. So there will be times when SLAs are broken, and this is just an idea of what to do in the event that that happens. First of all is move quickly. You certainly want to jump on it. You want to have a meeting with that vendor to find out what went wrong. Maybe this is a one-off situation. Maybe it's something that is indicating a bigger issue that's on the horizon. This may be a time for you to do an on-site audit and visit that vendor. Maybe the vendor just doesn't understand the significance that those SLAs are having on your performance with your customers. So certainly jump on it quickly, get the right people involved, have a very direct discussion with the vendor to find out what's going on. But should it get to the point where those SLAs continue to be missed, they fail to meet the SLAs, again, hopefully back in that original contract management where you were writing the contract, negotiating it, there was language included in that contract that allowed you an opportunity to exit the relationship should these SLAs not be met. Hopefully you don't get to that point, but those are the strategies that should be taken should it occur. And here's a page of best practices for vendor contract and SLA management. I've mentioned most, if not all of these throughout the presentation, but make sure you have clearly defined contract signing authority in that management process, that you plan the negotiation and strategy prior to engaging with that vendor, that you manage the risks that were identified in that initial due diligence phase within the vendor contract. Termination rights are so important, so be sure you cover those in multiple ways in the contract. Be sure you're having a central storage of all of your contracts. A reliable tool is a great way to do that, so that you're also tracking those notification and non-renewal dates. Those SLAs are so important to write them as straightforward as possible. Making them too cumbersome will be very difficult to manage. Monitor that vendor's performance to those SLAs since you spent the time putting them in place. Make sure that you have some procedures for dispute resolution clearly defined, probably in that SLA as well. And understand that vendor contract management and SLA management does not end with contract signing. So I think that brings us to the end. Thanks everyone for attending today. I'm going to pass this back over to Jessie.
Great, thanks so much, Kelly. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending the first day of our 3-day boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Hillary and Kelly, for their time in sharing some important information on the third-party risk management lifecycle, including planning and risk assessments, due diligence, and contracting, all of which will tie in with tomorrow's second day, covering the activities in the ongoing stage. Tomorrow, VinMinder's Director of Information Security Operations, Lisa May Hill, will begin our ongoing sessions by covering vendor SOC reports and cybersecurity. Then, VinMinder's Senior Information Security Specialist, Hershey Long, will cover business continuity and disaster recovery plans. After that, VinMinder's CFO, Raman Zachariah, will wrap it up with vendor financial health. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, this next question is for you. Is it possible to use previous due diligence and risk assessment results if you use the vendor for multiple services?
The answer is technically no. Remember that we need to evaluate each product and service because they all have different risks. So starting with that inherent risk assessment, we should determine where the risks are, and that will help us guide our due diligence. Now, if you've already had a vendor participate in due diligence, chances are you might already have some of those documents, and it's okay to work with the vendor to leverage or just confirm that those are the correct documents. But it's really important to evaluate each product and service on its own, just so that you don't miss anything, and it's really easy to do if you assume all the risks are the same. I hope that helps.
That's great. Thanks, Hillary. Kelly, this next question is for you. Is it important to record the actual measurement of the SLAs, including requiring documentation from the vendors to support the results? Should this only be required if there is an issue?
I would say that's going to depend on how the SLA is written. Hopefully, the SLA is written to require that level of documentation and that level of monitoring. But not every SLA would probably go to that detail. Depending, I know I keep saying this, but depending on the vendor and the service that you have will depend on how in-depth those SLAs are written. But it is important to remember that whatever you expect to get from that vendor as it relates to SLA, that it should be laid out clearly in the contract, because if it's not laid out clearly in the contract, then it's left to interpretation. And what generally happens, what I have seen, is both sides have a different interpretation. And when it comes to a vendor who is underperforming, that is certainly when that will become a problem. So avoid that from becoming a problem and make it a best practice to require as much detail as possible, including getting the actual measurement, the actual documentation to support that measurement.
Perfect, thanks. Hillary, we'll come back to you for this next question.
Okay.
Do you perform OFAC checks on all vendors or critical only?
You definitely should perform them on all vendors. Obviously our critical vendors and even our high-risk vendors get the most robust due diligence, but OFAC checks are really important. It's good to keep in mind that the smaller a business or a vendor is doesn't mean that they have less risk. And in fact, some businesses that are small businesses that are cash-based have a high risk for money laundering and some other things that we don't want to be involved in. So it is really important to do that check on all your vendors.
Perfect. Kelly, we'll come back to you for this one. For every contract renewal, do we need to refresh due diligence before every contract renewal?
So hopefully Hillary will agree with my answer. So I would say, as a best practice, I would say yes to that. Again, hopefully you are performing that due diligence annually. So if you're performing it annually or some regular basis, depending on the risk of that vendor, then the chances are that will come around the time of a contract renewal, because good timing to set that up is around the renewal of the contract. So absolutely best practice would be yes. If it's a critical or a high-risk vendor, you're going to, again, review those vendors' controls and continue to monitor their risk on that routine basis. Again, most likely it would be an annual basis. So it doesn't hurt to go ahead and review the contract terms. At the same time, I've mentioned that in my presentation, you know, there's so many changes, especially in the privacy laws, and they continue to change. You know, you just may find that there are some gaps in a contract that might have been written 5, 6 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. So even if it's not at renewal, it's certainly a good practice for these critical and high-risk vendors to be very aware of the gaps that do exist and try to take steps to close some of those gaps. You may not be able to close all of them mid-contract term, but it's certainly worth the effort.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. We know everyone's time is very valuable, so we are going to pause on questions for a moment to cover some important follow-up items to be aware of to wrap up the hour. However, if you do have time and would like to stick around longer to hear more answers, we will continue Q&A for a few more questions just in a moment. Don't forget, you can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources on the third-party risk management lifecycle, planning, risk assessments, due diligence, and contracting. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on this site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session. That recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to thank Hillary and Kelly for their time and great content, as well as addressing questions that came in. We hope those answers were helpful. The questions we answer in the next few minutes, we will also be following up via email in case you can't stick around to hear the answer to your particular question. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon. Okay, thanks everyone. We will now continue with a few more questions for those that have time and would like to stay on a few extra moments. Hillary, we'll come back to you for this next one.
Okay.
What if there are multiple products and services from a single vendor and each has a different vendor owner? Who is responsible for actually managing the vendor?
It's a great question, and this is something that happens at a lot of organizations. So a general best practice is that the vendor owner who has the highest risk sort of runs the vendor by default. Now, by no means is this easy. We like to see organizations who have these situations designate something called an enterprise risk manager for that vendor. So somebody to take the lead to consolidate the different performance and risk reviews and present them to the vendor in, a single view. That isn't always possible. So if your organization is struggling with this, I really suggest getting together and talking about your individual risks, your engagements, and see if you can determine, where the most risk is, where we need the vendor to be addressed, and delegate that to a person or two. What we're trying to avoid for that vendor is having 15 different performance reviews or, submitting, 15 pieces of risk information that are essentially the same. And it does require coordination, and that's why third-party risk management can jump in there and help and make some suggestions about who should be that universal owner. And that's not to say the universal owner has to do everything, but they should be sort of the top level consolidator and presenter of that data. I hope that's helpful.
That's great. Thank you, Hillary. Kelly, this next question is for you. How do we ensure that contracts aren't signed prior to doing the proper due diligence?
That's a really tough question to answer because it's going to depend on each individual company, organization, and how you have your third-party risk management structured. And even if you do have it structured in a very organized way, how diligent is your company and all of the various people in the company that are working with vendors out there, how diligent are they at following the process that you set? It certainly starts with having those strong governance documents in place, the policy and the program that outlines it. It should outline that contract management process. Hopefully that process is centralized. Hopefully all managers in your company know what that process is. Just because we're all human and we forget, it takes constant reminding of these managers within your organization that this process exists. So hopefully having that and a tool to manage the contract workflow, which hopefully will put some consistency in place across your organization, hopefully that will help ensure compliance. But I'm not being naive. I don't think any of us should be naive. It is a challenge, and it is one that we see frequently, and it's just one that the appropriate person in the organization, wherever that responsibility rests, needs to continuously massage and work on.
Great. Hillary, this next question is for you.
Okay.
Who is responsible for defining the criteria for critical?
So that definitely should come from the third-party risk management team, but it should have buy-in from senior leadership, compliance, some of the stakeholders that are going to be involved in the process. But third-party risk management should take the initiative, define the criteria, get it approved, and put it in the policy. So that way everybody can agree that these are the things that determine if a vendor is critical or not.
Perfect. Thanks, Hillary. Sally, we'll come back to you for this one. We have a template that legal created that is used to send vendors when a contract is ended. Who is responsible for following up with the vendor, a business unit, vendor management, etc.?
And that will be determined based on the your particular governance that has been established at your organization. Who has that responsibility? I've seen it be legal. I've seen it be contracting. I've seen it as finance. I've seen it as a business owner also. There's really no one right answer, but the most important thing is that you are tracking those contract termination dates and that someone is tasked or has the responsibility to actually notify the vendor of contract cancellation. Again, most contracts do have some required actual notification within the contract, or they will likely auto-renew unless that auto-renewal language is not in there. All of that, of course, is dependent on the contract as well. But it is, again, I can repeat it, and Hillary said it, beautifully multiple times, but it's having that appropriate governance program in place with the appropriate guidelines established, with making sure that everybody in the organization knows what their role and responsibility is with that. That is the best way to handle any and all of these questions, actually.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary and Kelly, for answering some more of those. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. We'll see you tomorrow for our second day of the boot camp. Thank you.